Critical Unlearnings, my Ecs210 journey. I am in a unique position in relation to my second-year colleagues. I'm the only one of my year and my degree in my course. I've already taught 9 lessons in the classroom and worked in depth with curriculum and planning. However, the learnings from this course are far more unique and difficult than I imagined. They've been invaluable in humbling me to the challenges of the personal in this profession, and have bestowed upon me the ability to see a fuller picture of how schooling and curriculum got to be where they are today, and how we as teachers can maneuver through our role. Bobbitt gave us a clear and disturbing picture of how schooling and society in early settler Canada was explicitly racist to all, in a twisted hierarchy of eugenicist values. New readings on the particulars of how this manifested in education, who was and was not worthy or capable of higher learning and why, reminded me of the Santana quote, "Those who cannot remember the past are doomed to repeat it." Our language today as we speak of schooling, First Nations, and refugee children can be chillingly akin to the arguments used to subjugate people of color and Eastern Europeans at Canada's founding. A difficult adjustment to make was being openly critical of current practices and even the learnings and readings in our own classes. We are usually taught a strange mix of social justice and compliance to the norm, especially as teachers at the very start of our careers. We started with the Tyler rationale, a teacher-centric model curriculum still partially in use to this day. This was meant to work for every school, every child, regardless of community or student context. How can the child ever be irrelevant in schooling? While the Tyler rationale is useful for creating a baseline of skills and literacies that we all must gain fluency in as a society, the lack of inclusivity, meaningful assessment for learning rather than of, and largely ineffective transmission style of teaching make this model outdated. This was a pretty easy one, but then we had to be critical of ourselves and our own experiences. Through Kumashiro and an essay about my values, I had to evaluate who was served by the learnings and knowledge presented in curriculum, and struggle with the idea that learning is not correcting what students already know. With Maxine Green, I tried to reconcile Tyler-based curriculum with teaching arts and aesthetic experience, which flies in the face of objectivity and standardization. I realized that my professional capital as a teacher is essential to running a successful classroom. I have to teach my way in order to be effective. This made me feel so much more strongly that teachers need to be able to determine curriculum as products of schools, as the gross but intelligent Ben Levin said. We all have opinions about them, but we have to trust teachers in order for curriculum to work in practice, and our practices have to be flexible to be effective. We have to fear failure less. Kids today have access to all the knowledge in the world. They need us to help them navigate it and communicate it, not to parse and cut and transmit knowledge in one way. This leads us to another great reading and blog post, Good Students versus Bad Students. I tackled how we sort kids this way despite knowing better, despite perhaps being that kid, as I sometimes was. In my field experience at a community school, I found that sometimes it became teacher versus bad kid instead of teacher and child versus problems. The so-called good kids could be ignored or praised heavily, and the kids who needed the most love were left behind, sometimes out of necessity for these busy teachers. I quickly learned how many behaviors occur without us knowing, even when we think we're on our A game. I know from my work with inner city kids and kids with autism spectrum disorder that behavior is communication. It is never personal, and this reading helped me frame that knowledge in a classroom setting. I hope that it will stick in difficult situations more often than not as I practice. This brings us to Michael Foucault, who said that every educational system is a political means of maintaining or modifying the appropriation of discourse. In relation to citizenship and treaties, our education system seems to be discouraging our full involvement as citizens of Treaty 4 and of society at large. We mostly learned about treaties in the past tense. We learned about levels of government, volunteering, and other pro-social ways to be a personally responsible citizen, but very little, if anything, about being a knowledgeable organizer, protester, decision maker as a participatory citizen. Protests and owning our power is often discouraged in mainstream schooling. Most scarce of all was any education about being a justice-oriented citizen who worked for justice and equity, not just charity. Being a justice-oriented citizen who questions power and the causes of social problems goes hand in hand with defending treaty rights. And our lack of knowledge about this could explain why the general white population is so hostile towards First Nations. This is something I'm determined not to squash, but to encourage in my classroom. These learnings challenged what Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie would call my single story, the stereotypes and myopic view I inherited as a member of a flawed society. However, nothing shook my worldview quite like the presentation on Aboriginal math by Dr. Gail Russell. As you might expect from an arts ed student, I despise math. I was not good at it, and Math Makes Sense asked me to actually engage with the whys and hows of math instead of just memorizing it. I had an amazing teacher who taught it passionately and well, and achieved some success with him from grades 7 to 10 under his wing. Overall, though, math was hard and cold and inflexible, the opposite of arts. Gail taught us that Aboriginal math cannot be separated from context like so much of Western math is. She taught us that 5-year-olds and infants alike intuitively understand math concepts like fractions and subtraction when they're put in contexts that kids can grasp, and when math is discovered by them through inquiry, not dictated to them through transmission. It's easy enough to consume and criticize curriculum, to transmit and enhance it, but to produce it and develop, this class has given me greater confidence to assert myself within curriculum by making me challenge racism, bigotry, assumptions, and often messy ways of thinking, first in others and then in myself. I'm grateful to have grown as a producer of curriculum, and as a teacher who will flex to face her own fears, even ones that remain, such as the fear of being problematic, of not being knowledgeable enough, fear of math. Curriculum is a guideline, but teaching and learning are life itself. Thank you, and happy learning.